I'd like to welcome people to a session on social media and negotiation. And this was really stimulated by Mike Wheeler's at Mike Wheeler's initiative, and he suggested that this would be an interesting topic. And I thought, how much is really known about social media? And so the answer is almost everyone seems to think that it matters a lot in negotiation, but but surprisingly little has been systematically studied. And so I'm going to give a little bit of a lengthy framing introduction, and then we'll get on to our panelists, whom I'll introduce at this point. I'm assuming, can people see my screen fine? Okay, so in searching the literature, we found this in the negotiation literature. We found social media to be relatively neglected. And so I reached out to a lot of my colleagues and friends, quite respected negotiation scholars, for their suggestions on good papers. And I'll leave the quotes anonymous, but these are the kinds of responses that I heard. Good question. I can't think of anything that's relevant here. I'm CCing a few colleagues who may have some great ideas, which, by the way, they did. Another very well-known scholar of negotiation: I've not seen anyone doing work in this area. Sounds like a great dissertation topic, which is a classic way of getting people involved. And it turns out, of course, that there's lots of highly relevant work being done in closely related areas and fields. So communication theory, sociology, marketing, political science, labor relations, digital diplomacy, stakeholder and influence mapping, lobbying and political strategy, cyber influence campaigns. Turns out, obviously, there's a lot of work because social media is a big phenomenon these days. And for a lot of references and ideas from Joel Kutcher-Gershenfeld, Francesca Gino, Max Bazerman, Jared Curhan, Alison Wood Brooks, Deepak Malhotra, Maurice Schweitzer, Don Moore, Sherry Melamed, Chandra Matz, Michael Maffei, and others. I just mentioned them because you were good guides to a lot of the things that we might have otherwise missed, although the literature was fairly barren. I always not only ask academics, but I ask practitioners. And some of you may know that we've had that with Nick Burns and a distinguished diplomat, and Bob Mnookin at the Harvard Law School, we've interviewed, sometimes for days on end, all the former secretaries of state about their most challenging negotiations. And so in a relatively recent interview, I asked the following question.
There's an image of negotiation that's kind of an old one, that's of, people in a small room figuring things out. And yet in a world of social media, it strikes me that the role of social media is much greater, and in fact, first order with respect to ongoing negotiations. And I'm curious, is that perception accurate? And are there best practices and big mistakes one can make as a negotiator vis-a-vis social media?
Oh, sure. I mean, first of all, you want to try to stay away from it. And I think what it's done is it's probably appropriately driven negotiations into a much more secret, private track. I would try to do a lot more in secret than we were doing back then, and with a smaller group, in effect. I think that you need to not let the externals come in and screw up your ability to have the dynamic you create.
So in asking John Kerry this question, I think two things are notable about his response. First, absolutely, it's a first order effect in modern diplomatic negotiations, and he immediately said that. Secondly, his response was not, how do we use this, or what are best practices, other than try to hide from it because it screws things up. And that suggests that there's a lot to be learned, certainly in practice. Another distinguished negotiator and friend, Wendy Sherman, who now heads the Center for Public Leadership at the Kennedy School. She's had a remarkable career, but most recently and prominently as the chief negotiator in the U.S. in the Iran nuclear deal. And I asked her the same question by Zoom in a class this spring on that Nick Burns, Bob Mnookin, and I were teaching, and I asked her exactly this question. By the way, Carrie went on at length to explain about how they hid from social media in the getting the Iran negotiations going through the Sultan of Oman, and then the Cuba normalization negotiations, which they were very secretive about as well. But Wendy Sherman asked exactly this question, and you'll see, because it's a Zoom class, you'll see Bob Mnookin pop up as he says something or other, but it's primarily Wendy here.
Um, on social media, huge effect on our Blackberries and iPhones. We were still in the Blackberry world. Europe had moved on to iPhones. The Iranians would tweet from inside the negotiating room. So I'd walk out and the press would know something I had to respond to. It was a tweet from Zarif that actually made us know we were going to get the deal, because he tweeted pretty much that we were there, and then he tried to get more, but we already knew we had won in many ways. But I also used Twitter, or used texting actually, when Helga Schmid, who was my counterpart and really is the unsung hero of this negotiation, ran most of what we did, and coordinated all the talks. And when the US and Iran had bilateral talks, which were frequent, she always sat in them so that the rest of the P5+1 would know the US wasn't double dealing them. But I could text her if I needed her to do something. She could text me if she needed me to do something, and it was very valuable. So both devices and social media played a profound role, as you pointed out, Jim.
So again, from a distinguished practitioner, a remarkable diplomat, the sense that social media really matters, but how it matters. And her answer even quickly shifted over to the use of devices to text with other negotiators in the room. And so this right away begins to give us a sense that there's much uncharted territory, which our first two panelists will discuss. But there are a bunch of social media roles for negotiators that we're not primarily going to talk about. A new general communication channel, if you had a press release, you used to be able to fax it out or by radio or TV, and social media is another channel for that. There's actually a lot of work in the negotiation and allied fields on the effects of electronically mediated interactions by phone, by email, by video conference, and certainly by social media. And there are a couple of references there, though there are many more. And we've quite recently seen how social media can be used to directly intervene in negotiations from afar. And, as Donald Trump was talking to Kim Jong-un, Mr. Chairman, Joe Biden may be sleepy and very slow, but he's not a rabid dog. He's actually somewhat better than that. But I'm the only one who can get done what you have to be. You should act quickly, get the deal done. See you soon. And if you happen to be Rex Tillerson, you got the following message very shortly thereafter. I told Rex Tillerson, our wonderful Secretary of State, that he's wasting his time trying to negotiate with little rocket man. Save your energy, Rex. We'll do what needs to be done. So again, there's this kind of intervention directly from afar, which by and large could have happened, but in a much less direct way. So those are some interesting areas for focus. But where I want to talk about is, and what our panel is focused on, is really three things: how social media can be used to learn about, influence, and mobilize parties away from the table and in an ethical manner. And the ethics of this are tricky. A core insight from much of what we'll be talking about comes from David Laxus and my work on 3D negotiation. And that's the following: that the most important aspects of negotiation strategy often involve moves away from the table to set up the most promising possible situation once you're actually at the table. So lots of negotiation work, especially in social science, consists of theories and then testing in laboratory settings. What we often find is away from the table actions have profound influences on what happens at the table. And among many negotiators, those are core to their approach. So for example, if we were analyzing Tommy Koh's negotiations, or as a negotiator in the US-Singapore Free Trade Agreement negotiations, A traditional image of negotiation would be the two chief negotiators dealing with each other across the table. When you get into it, this is what the actual reality looks like. There is a nexus of the negotiations, but there are a whole panoply of other related negotiations that are taking place and heavily influencing what's going on in that central place. If we looked at Bruce Wasserstein's dealings with a dominant shareholder, Michel David Vey, the former head of Lazard, about taking Lazard public, you might look at that direct interaction, but you would really have to look at a whole series of other stakeholders and constituents to understand how that was being played out. And that too is a very big part of negotiation process. Or when we honored President Juan Santos, the president of Colombia, who negotiated with the guerrilla group, the FARC, away from the table. You could look at the negotiations as Santos and his team dealing directly with the FARC. When you got into it in any accuracy and depth, the actual negotiation had multiple fronts with that were related to one another, and a lot of these were connected, indirectly but highly influential on the process. So, if I were crystallizing our focus, it's boosting the chances of making a target deal by using social media to learn about, influence, and mobilize parties, and in a way that respects ethics and privacy, which is tricky in this domain. And to get in a little bit more detail before I turn it over to our panelists, um, first of all, to explore and learn more about the parties, who decides and who is directly or indirectly influential. Often the parties at the table are only sort of the tip of the iceberg. To understand their interests, BATNA's relationships, and possible coalitional structures. Secondly, beyond learning is to wield more effective influence, direct influence, how to anticipate their likely points and arguments, how to frame messages that will resonate, avoid those that will backfire, and indirect influence via other respected sources that can sway the more directly involved parties. And then thirdly, beyond learning and influencing, is mobilizing potential supporters and or deterring or neutralizing opponents. And I would note here that a lot of literature derived from the experiences of the Arab Spring, the Occupy movement, patient advocacy groups, both self-organizing and by pharma companies, Greenpeace activists, Joel Kutcher-Gershenfeld and Michael Maffei pointed us toward a number of examples of union organizing that were very profoundly influential at the table. So I'd like you to think in those three terms: learn, influence, and mobilize as areas that we're exploring. Now, because there's so relatively little literature in the negotiation field, although lots in other domains, we're going to start by describing the direct experiences of senior practitioners with social media in diplomatic negotiations with some ongoing challenges. And then after two of our panelists will address those questions, we're then going to look at three case studies in more depth. And the idea is to draw provisional prescriptions, lessons, and areas for future work. And we've consciously chosen these cases to illustrate a range of settings: large-scale corporate initiative that was highly public, in fact, globally so; a medium-scale hospital versus union organizing negotiation, which was quite public; and then a very small-scale corporate negotiation involving a town and a cannabis operation, which was locally controversial. So to undertake this, what I'd like to do is introduce the first two of our panelists. From Andalusia, Alvaro Renedo, who is a Spanish career diplomat, currently a fellow at the Belfer Center at Harvard. In his prior diplomatic life, which continues, he was the director of the Department of European Affairs in the G20 and the presidency of the Spanish government, and lots more, which you can read on his bio. He's going to discuss some of his past and current experiences with social media and diplomacy. And secondly, following shortly after, is Catherine Kluver-Ashbrook, the founding executive director of the Future of Diplomacy project at the Kennedy School, executive director of the new project on Europe and the transatlantic relationship at the Kennedy School, and a lot more from a career at CNN to other things. And she's going to discuss about how diplomats and foreign ministers are or are not adapting to the era of digital diplomacy. So Alvaro, I'd like to turn it over to you at this point.
Thank you, Professor Sebenius. In light of my professional experience, I've identified three primary uses of social media and diplomacy. The first is to act as a communication channel, as was said. Conveying information and values, for example, a tweet condemning a military coup underscores commitment with democracy. A second use is to act as a source of information of what occurs within states and organisms. Ben Rhodes, deputy NSA with Obama, has written that it was by Twitter that the White House found out that Tripoli fell in August 2011. The third use of social media is to shape negotiations, which ultimately entails a delicate combination of the two mentioned uses, communication and information. Two examples. The first and most recent one is a landmark ruling by the German Constitutional Court on the European Central Bank's public debt purchasing program. This ruling was made public on May 5th and has had a tectonic impact in the EU. It declares void a 2018 judgment by the EU Court of Justice, which had validated the ECB's purchasing program. The German ruling has been considered a unilateral declaration of constitutional independence from the EU legal order. Some have already compared it to South Carolina's nullification of federal law in pre-Civil War America. This is a very thorny issue in Europe for two reasons. First, it sets a dangerous precedent that encourages populist and liberal movements to defy the ECJ. Shortly after the ruling, Polish authorities declared void previous ECJ decisions against Polish judicial reforms. And second, the ruling has unleashed fears that it may affect future ECB purchasing programs. The German Constitutional Court has tried to assuage concerns, indicating that the ruling does not affect the ECB's COVID-19 program, but some fear that once Pandora's box is open, things may play out differently. Shortly after the ruling, social media poured opinion and analysis. Tweets and blogs clustered in two main groups. First, the critics of the German ruling. This majority group underlines that a threat to the EU legal system is a direct threat to its political order. If the Commission fails to act against Berlin, it can hardly legitimize its action against Warsaw or Budapest. For this reason, voices from this group propose that the Commission initiate an infringement procedure against Germany, which equates to suing Germany before the ECJ. This group is formed by academics, journalists, and institutional figures from Europe in general, but also from Germany, including Wolfgang Schäuble, Speaker of the Bundestag, Wolfgang Ischinger, Chairman of the Munich Security Conference, and a presiding judge from the German Supreme Court. The second group are the defendants of the ruling, a minority formed by the judges of the Constitutional Court, one of which gave a newspaper interview stating that the ECB should not see itself as the master of the universe. That spurred intense reactions on Twitter, marking a divide between social media and conventional media, to which the judges have recurred for generational reasons. Only 19% of Germans over 65 use social media. The Economic Council of the German Christian Democrat Party also supported the ruling, questioning the legitimacy of the ECB purchase programs. And this proves that question marks cannot be dissipated as to how this ruling may affect future ECB actions. Other supporters of the ruling have been the governments of Poland and Hungary, which have felt vindicated in their critiques on recent ECJ judgments concerning them. How has all of this played out so far? On Sunday, May 10th, the President of the Commission, von der Leyen, published a historical press statement, according to which the Commission may initiate infringement proceedings against Germany. The language and the substance of her message resonated with social media and blog posts, which actually made it to her desk. The debate continues to unfold. Some observations. Social media has affected, one, the speed of the debate, accelerating, even catalyzing it, interconnecting and influencing in real time opinions from policy analysts, academia, and institutions. Two, the range of the debate, facilitating its rapid spread on a continental scale. It is not frequent for a national ruling to have such transnational reverberance. Three, the impact of the debate, inspiring conventional media and EU institutional response. In sum, social media have influenced the shaping of multi-party negotiation between the Commission, the ECB, the German government, the Bundesbank, and the Constitutional Court. Another very brief example. In 2017, the Commission published its controversial white paper on the future of the EU. President Rajoy asked me for my assessment. I talked to different loci of power in the government, ministers, ambassadors, with diverging opinions. At the same time, the President of the Commission's Chief of Staff was asking me by WhatsApp for a tweet by President Rajoy supporting the white paper. This shows the enormous power social media can wield. One of the most influential people in Europe was asking me for a mere tweet. I explained to President Rajoy the different views within the government and underlined that Juncker was asking for this favor. After careful consideration, Rajoy gave green light to his publication. The dilemma at the end of the day was whether to publish or not a tweet, a bargaining chip in a complex multilateral negotiation to set the parameters of the debate as momentous as the future of Europe. And this shows that social media are a crucial dimension for setting up and influencing diplomatic negotiations.
So Alvaro, that was an enormous amount of information in an admirably compressed time period, and we
I
appreciate
committed
it.
to 5 minutes.
And unlike me, you actually stayed within your time limit. I'd like to just note a couple of things. You said a lot, but the ruling of the German Constitutional Court, as you indicated, very quickly and with a much wider range, and bringing in all kinds of other parties very quickly, from media to political parties, that ruling very directly will impact the European Central Bank's asset purchase program, their COVID recovery program. Those negotiations are intense and ongoing, and trying to imagine how they play out absent social media in a time when that wasn't there just gives you a sense of how different the world is and how much there is to learn about those. And your other example of a bargaining chip, I think, is really key. Well, thank you, and I'm sure there'll be many questions around this issue. Catherine, if we could turn to you for a different perspective, or I shouldn't say different, but a complementary perspective on what Alvaro has laid out.
Well, thank you, Jim. And I'm going to throw the aperture a little wider and take a step back in terms of how we got to Alvaro's very concrete examples and take you on a little historical trip, if you will. And Jim has pointed out what should be happening in the ideal circumstance in terms of how we might use social media if we're the bureaucracy, the actor, the negotiator at the table, learning, listening, engaging. And the truth of the matter is that ministries of foreign affairs didn't always use and see this in this way. So I want to take you on a very quick historical trip, give you a very concrete example of how we got started in the way that Alvaro described, and looking at the TTIP negotiations, 2013, specifically through 2016, and then sort of point the road ahead where we're going. So
some people may not know the TTIP, so you might explain just a bit.
That's the transatlantic trade and investment partnership. So it's supposed to be the enormous economic deal. I mean, what the president's trying to forge, again, right now, between the European Union and the United States. And it's a negotiation that ultimately ended up failing in 2016, into large part because European publics, leaders, did not feel that they could get this through their national parliaments. And there we saw a very direct correlatory effect by what was going on Twitter, and how Twitter connected to the street, and then how those two pressure points influenced the negotiation at the table. So I'll take you through those details in just a second, but I thought it worth widening the aperture for just a moment and taking you through this remarkable development that we've seen essentially over the last 10 to 12 years, right? Because we started, as Jim rightly pointed out, with a data revolution. And within 4 years, we were at a phase that was a communication revolution. And within 4 or 5 years, we were really at the doorsteps of a data revolution, which is, as we all know, going to change the way that we work and the way that we think about how basic process design functions in bureaucracies. So the communication revolution is an interesting one, because an American State Department responded just like they may have with respect to new tools in the propaganda war and the Cold War. So if you think about the early onset of Hillary Clinton moving into the State Department with Alec Ross as her innovation advisor, it was to make Silicon Valley just another tool in the diplomatic toolkit, right? Is to engage through apps to do better development policy, to be more present. You'll all remember, of course, the 2009 Iranian Revolution, keeping Twitter from updating, from doing a critical update so that the Iranians could keep tweeting. And Gezi Park and the examples that Jim cited in his presentation, those were all the critical tools that MFAs, particularly, of course, the US State Department with Silicon Valley in their back pocket, thought that they could use diplomatically. But the bargain that they didn't make, maybe as consequentially, and we learned that in John Kerry's statement, is that, of course, how quickly technology would advance, so that these technology companies would no longer need the eye of the needle of the American State Department, certainly, or European MFAs to, quote unquote, do international bidding, be present in international processes. So that by 2011, Apple is the biggest technology company, nay, the biggest company in the world. Facebook is going public. And you suddenly see these big organizations carving up the world in different ways that takes the bureaucracy and the controlling element, mainly the State Department, out of critical negotiations. Facebook and China are rivaling in Africa, and for territory in the global South, where Facebook is not only Facebook in the way that we know it, but it is the very internet. It is the very connecting power. So within 5 years, we shift from a communications revolution to a data revolution. And that has sort of extreme impacts on how now diplomacy gets done, or rather how Western bureaucracies are cast in trying to wrangle this new independent beast. I'm not going to talk about Russia and China. We're all hyper aware of how they have used tools that were developed in Silicon Valley. I'll just reflect on how the advent of the data revolution coincides with sort of companies taking on, or the usage of digital media takes on a life of its own, such that it begins to influence major negotiations. And that's where TTIP is really a wonderful example. So in 2013, as Alvaro noted, the Commission, there was a report that was leaked, which indicated that the Commission was very nervous that social media might torpedo these TTIP negotiations. Up until then, press had been relatively neutral. This was a relatively neutral breeding ground. The minute this came out, this became somewhat of a buzz on Twitter. And over the following years, 2.5 years, Twitter became really an advocacy platform that was deeply anti-American, because again, this coincided with the use of, or the revelations of the Edward Snowden investigation and the usage of American technology in listening, digital listening, to other countries, including their allies. So on social media, you began to see, and you're able to track on Twitter, how that tide really shifted, began to connect very effectively to street protests. Berlin saw an anti-TTIP protest in 2014 that was the largest public demonstration in its modern history, such that it changed the tide of ability, or sort of what could be done ultimately at the table, because people no longer felt that this particular agreement, in the way that it was negotiated, would be able to make it through the ratification processes of the national governments within the European Union. And so this is coinciding with that breaking point. Now, what does this mean? So technology corporations have quickly overtaken the abilities of MFAs to control their capacities. And so what has happened, very interestingly, in the last couple of years, is that major ministries of foreign affairs have realized that because of the power that technology corporations now hold across the world, they had best be present in the conversation. They had best be there to express their interests, mitigate, if they can, certain influences. So you have seen the advent of a digital ambassador, or a series of digital ambassadors. France has an ambassador level person in Silicon Valley. Denmark has an ambassador level person in Silicon Valley. You have digital ambassadors within ministries of foreign affairs that have remained in their home countries. But to a large part, the ones that have stayed home, quote unquote, are still engaged in what we might consider digital listening. So they're still very much stuck in part in the communications revolution, and realizing and trying to use systems of analysis that will allow to forecast and be anticipatory on how certain pieces of news might play on Twitter, and how that, or on any social media, and how that might interplay with national in negotiation or political environments, shall we say. Very few ministries of foreign affairs are actually getting ready, or have the capacity to get ready to what is happening now with the data revolution. How, for instance, big data will shape any type of, for instance, trade negotiation, and how that will change meritocratic processes within ministries of foreign affairs. If you think about what it takes to be a senior negotiator, it's years of practice, it's years at the table, it's years of dealing with complex situations. Well, when you have all of the data at your fingertips, what does that do to a mid-level negotiator? Does that amplify them? How does it change a meritocracy in a system that relies on seniority? How does it change consular services? Can that be completely taken away from ministries of foreign affairs? How does the ubiquity and advancement of big data tools and channels change the way that diplomatic negotiations function, but also the more sausage-making components, if you will, of foreign policy, keeping nationals safe in other countries? So that is what we're seeing come down the pike. And what we're seeing in Western bureaucracies is that, by and large, they're still insufficiently able and capable to use, to listen, and to engage, and to use sort of the knowledge that streams out of social media tools in an analytic way. And they've tried, the United States State Department has tried to be present in critical discussions to create anticipatory foreign policy. But by and large, technology has too quickly overtaken them to really be able to harness the kind of advantages that technology brings. So I apologize for being somewhat of a downer here, and I'm happy to provide and engage on other examples, but that is sort of the current state of play.
So Catherine, thank you very much. And I hope that the combined effect of what Catherine and Alvaro have laid out in a remarkably short time is really experientially, what does social media look like in these worlds? Not a priori, what do we think they look like, but with people who are on the ground, active in diplomatic negotiations. What's the effect? And Catherine pointed me to a lot of literature, some of which that she's written. The descriptive literature is beginning to catch up with the reality, but the analytic and prescriptive literature is nowhere close. And it strikes me that when you think of these three themes that will cut through our the presentations, the two that are past and the upcoming ones, learning, and whether that's digital listening, whether that's paying attention to Twitter streams, there's so many different ways. Influencing, which you can see as these various as these various social media have a profound effect on what happens at the negotiating table, and then often mobilizing groups that favor and add heft to what you're trying to do, or dealing with potential opponents. And those categories I think are helpful, but the particulars we really need to dig into. Now, what I promised was that we were going to look at a range of topics, and specifically, we're going to focus now on on two other with two other panelists. I'd like to introduce them to you, but these are more corporate and public negotiations, not in the diplomatic sphere. So first, to introduce you to Ben Cook, who you'll see in a moment, the founder of Red Pill Strategies, which is a boutique strategy shop focused on online corporate challenges like building or blocking impactful coalitions, engaging with influential stakeholders. In an earlier life, he consulted to the White House on disrupting ISIS recruitment and a whole lot more. And Ben is going to talk about Amazon's New York City HQ2, their second headquarters debacle. And after our next speaker, he'll return to the stage and talk about a cannabis cultivation challenge in Massachusetts. Isaac Silberberg will be talking about another interesting sort of early social media influence on negotiation. Isaac is an MIT analyst, educated analyst and advisor on complex negotiations at Lax Sabanius, a firm that I co-founded with David Lax, and a research associate at the business school. And Isaac worked at a civic tech startup helping to sell the first blockchain voting system used in an American federal election, and then basically went AWOL from these other pursuits to be a national budget manager in the Pete for America campaign and lots of others. And he'll talk about the early role of social media in the SEIU efforts to unionize the Beth Israel Deaconess Medical Center. So I'm going to turn this over now to Ben and to tell us a little bit about the Amazon situation.
Everyone, thanks, Jim. Bear with me a second while I share a screen. So I'm hoping that you all can see this now.
Yes.
Great. Thanks, Jim. So as Jim mentioned, my name's Ben. I founded a boutique strategy shop focused on the challenges that organizations face as they move from thinking about social media as just one channel out of many to take an existing strategy and push it out. And instead turn that on its head and try to develop strategies that are native to this new medium. So over the next 30 minutes, Isaac and I are going to take you through 3 case studies in how businesses can fail, succeed, or improve in their online negotiations. Specifically, we're going to be looking at enhanced party mapping and better informed coalition management, as playing potentially critical roles in social media negotiation. So to begin, I'm going to tell you the story of Amazon's failed bid for a second headquarters in Long Island City, New York. And if the previous presenters didn't convince you that this stuff is important, I hope that Jeff Bezos's experience here will. So if you're not familiar with the case, this was a search for a location for Amazon's second headquarters. This was going to be home to 50,000 jobs, very high paying. This is a very juicy development target. So more than 200 cities submitted proposals. It attracted an enormous amount of media attention. And in the end, in late 2018, New York was announced as one of the lucky winners. When this was announced, this deal had 85% local support. The governor said that he would change his name to Amazon Cuomo if Amazon would just pick them. And the mayor was incredibly supportive as well. This was a big deal. This was very exciting in the community. But that 15% soon became a real problem. And they erupted in protests around the city, very high profile and particularly dominant online. You can see them here at a particular city council meeting in a photo that went massively viral. And when Amazon first learned of these protests, their approach, as summarized in this Bloomberg article about the inner workings of the negotiation team, was essentially that they didn't do anything. They were so convinced of the desirability of this project, of this deal, that all they had to do was announce the winner and not engage remotely online. Negotiations theorists call this a decide, announce, defend approach. And internally, apparently it was summarized as F you or Amazon. So as you might guess, this didn't turn out very well for them. In fact, a key local official who had become an opponent of the deal was nominated to a board that had oversight over a lot of the deal terms. And at that point, after repeated public humiliations, the company just withdrew, called off the deal altogether, and New York City lost out on the opportunity to have 50,000 high-paying jobs. So the question here is, how did an unfunded ad hoc group of amateur online activists defeat one of the most valuable tech-savvy companies in the world over a multi-billion-dollar deal that had 85% local support? And then what can we learn from examining that question? So the analogy that I like to draw here is that we are the British in the Revolutionary War. We are the best funded, best trained, best supported, largest military in the world, but on a revolutionary battlefield, we are completely outclassed. And we're lined up with our red coats that just paint a giant X on our chests. And this is true even of companies with technological expertise. Amazon, through its web services, hosts half the internet, including this conference call. So this is a new field. This is a new discipline, and it's one that's taking on increased urgency as the world moves ever more digital, particularly in this pandemic. So to begin to get our heads around this massive David versus Goliath defeat, we're going to borrow a tool from the field of social media intelligence and use it to visualize the universe of conversation around Amazon's HQ2 deal in Long Island City. So what you're looking at here is a network graph. What we did is we got access to premium access to Twitter's API and analyzed data from this conversation using a tool. In this case, it's Gephi, but there are a number of these tools out there. And this is a snapshot sampling around a particularly pivotal city council meeting. In the paper that accompanies this presentation, we look at several snapshots through time to see how the conversation evolves and changes. But to just dive in and show a sampling of what you might learn from this, what you're looking at here, the dots represent individual Twitter users, the lines are conversations between them, and the distance or the centrality to the conversation is a measure of importance or influence within the network. And throughout, I'm going to use this red dot you see appearing on your screen here to indicate the sections of the graph that I'm going to be discussing next. So if we dive in here, the first observation that we have is how utterly peripheral and irrelevant Amazon is to this conversation. If you see their position on the graph, if you see the number of connections that they have to other users, Amazon had essentially no ability to respond to this online conversation. They had no ability to influence perceptions. And ultimately, this meant that they had no ability to shape the outcomes of this online conversation. They were absent from the Twitter universe. So if Amazon wasn't playing the role in shaping this conversation, who are these users who were shaping the way that New York City as a whole responded to and viewed this deal? Well, if you dive in, maybe unsurprising, but it is overwhelmingly activist. And specifically, this conversation is dominated by AOC, Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, aligned parties. Now, she had just won a shock upset victory over a well-established incumbent Democratic politician in a very hyper online campaign, and had built this coalition of these hyper online users who were very local, knowledge about the area, who were activated in this case to oppose this deal. So she is the most mentioned user in this network, but the remainder of the network is comprised of people in her camp. This is Zephyr Teachout is a Fordham law professor. She's the author of several anti-monopoly, anti-corruption books, very popular among the sort of Bernie Sanders supporting crowd, supporter of the Green New Deal. And these sort of democratic socialist aligned accounts share the posts that go the most viral. They play the most pivotal role in shaping how this network has evolved. And this is where it gets really interesting, because in this graph, you see this group of democratic socialist accounts literally surrounding this guy, Senator Michael Gianaris. He's the one I mentioned earlier, who, when he was appointed to a particular board with oversight over the deal, Amazon was so afraid of his opposition that they withdrew from the deal entirely. Now, what's interesting about Senator Gianaris is he was a lifelong moderate. This is a middle-of-the-road, largely pro-development individual who, when he saw Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez topple another moderate Democrat in a neighboring district, he swiftly moved to the left and began embracing these progressive stands, to the point that this lifelong moderate began calling himself the Amazon Slayer. And when you look at this network, it's no surprise why. This coalition of anti-development, democratic socialist users has completely drowned out all others when it comes to lobbying Michael Gianaris online. So this has obviously created quite a problem, but I want to dive into one final observation about this network, which is that this network is just defined and shaped by these small scale but highly active users who have very few followers, but are engaged in this peer-to-peer conversation where they are talking to individual users of different groups in different constituencies, and they're forming the bridges that tie together this network. In effect, you see them in real time here forming a digital coalition. And contrast this with the sort of top-down, bureaucratic, controllable conversations that we're used to. These users are the ones who are tying together this whole universe of conversation. But who are they? Well, if you dive in, they're almost exclusively immigration rights activists, which is somewhat bizarre. This deal, on the face of it, had nothing to do with immigration rights. It's strange that they're engaged in this conversation. They had a separate bone to pick with Amazon over its web services division's contract with the Immigration and Customs Enforcement. They believed that the company was insufficiently responsive to their demands that it change its policies with regard to immigration. And even though they had no interest in the specifics of the HQ2 deal, this was an opportunity for them to exert outsized leverage over the company. And this Isaac will go into this more in the next conversation, but this just really speaks to the power of sort of grounding in values in an online conversation. And this is overwhelmingly, I think, one of our findings is that any public negotiation like this presents just a unique vulnerability to activist pressure that might be completely unrelated to the specifics of the deal at hand. And that's particularly exacerbated when you take this decide, announce, defend approach that I mentioned. But it's these users and their online behaviors that lead to a coalition of 85% support the governor, the mayor being defeated by this small scale 15% group of users when they targeted key pressure points like Senator Michael Gianaris. So to zoom out a bit and just talk about the overall lessons that we can learn about social media and negotiations. This cartoon, you can see Jeff Bezos has picked a juicy big apple out of the fruit basket of America, and he's preparing to take a bite because he doesn't realize that what's inside it is this worm, this coalition of AOC-aligned users. And this really speaks to, I think, a core aspect of the work that we've been doing, which is looking at information asymmetries. In any negotiation, information is gold. Any sort of asymmetry gets magnified significantly. But what's significant about this case is that it's not that Amazon is bad at negotiating. It's that Amazon was completely blind to the situation on the ground. They had no idea what was inside that apple. And the results of that were very damaging. I mean, after Amazon announced that it would withdraw from the deal, there was an open letter published in the New York Times from union leaders, local elected officials, community leaders who implored Jeff Bezos to come back. But Amazon was blind even to that support, and they completely failed to mobilize this coalition on the ground in a meaningful way. So regardless of how you feel about the merits of this development opportunity, the specifics of the deal as it was announced, there was a deal to be made here. And so Amazon's blindness in the end meant that everyone lost out on that opportunity. So the overall lesson that we take away is, like it or not, you have to be prepared for this kind of pressure and this world that we're living in. So there are many more elements that we can unpack in the paper, too much to go into now. But this key question of how can businesses get ready, I think is really key. And for our next case study, we're going to go back in time to the earlier days of social media and a successful example of businesses doing this. So now over to Isaac.
All right.
So as Isaac, just before you begin, I want to stress, if we think of the themes that the panelists collectively worked out, learning about who the parties actually are, because you can imagine there was a negotiation at the city council level and with Amazon and otherwise, and the parties who were influential and had made a difference were largely invisible given the traditional approaches to negotiation here. And once one learns, then the possibilities of influencing or actually mobilizing. This is a success story from an opponent's perspective, but from an Amazon perspective, there were an enormous number of parties from unions who were typically suspicious of Amazon, but love the construction opportunities and some of the other aspects, which could have mobilized as a counterforce in a situation like this and profoundly influenced the actual negotiation. So as Catherine said, the aperture widens and you learn a lot. There are potentials for influence and mobilization. So we switch back a little bit in time to Isaac, the case Isaac's going to talk about. And I would note that the protagonist in this case is Paul Levy, who's in our audience. So you can ask him directly as we go forward.
All right. So thank you, Jim. And I am going to share my screen. So bear with me for a moment. Jim, can you see and hear?
Yes.
Wonderful. So next we're going to be just taking a look at a case with Paul, who is on the call with us right now. As Jim mentioned, at the time, this occurs in kind of 2005 to 2011, roughly in terms of time. And Paul was the CEO of Beth Israel Deaconess Medical Center, and his situation was that he was dealing with the Service Employees International Union, or the SEIU. So let's set the stage a little bit. The SEIU in 2005 merged with a local service union and decided that they were going to target teaching hospitals. Beth Israel is an excellent target for this union. It is an extremely large, prominent research institution that's also a teaching hospital for Harvard Medical School. And unionization would have very large implications for BIDMC. That includes rigid work rules for staff, cumbersome processes, restrictions that might harm morale, and importantly, because this is a teaching hospital, it would have encouraged adversarial relationships and prevented creativity and flexibility. And importantly, there were vast resource disparities between the parties right here. So Beth Israel had no financial resources to fend off a methodical corporate campaign from the SEIU. And Beth Israel had actually just completed a very difficult merger between Beth Israel and Deaconess, and had only actually experienced a positive operating margin for 2 or 3 years at this point. And this is 2005 to 2006. So Paul Levy, he's thoughtfully looked around the country to other hospitals and institutions that had undergone unionization efforts. Generally speaking, he's supportive of the rights of workers to unionize, but he also is extraordinarily committed to the hospital and to the patients and the community that the hospital actually serves. And in particular, he was moved by the experience of Yale New Haven Hospital, which had just gone through a unionization process recently. And the union leaned on local politicians to delay building permits, propose zoning changes. So the only height caps in all of New Haven zoning was actually the hospital. That was it. And other key pieces about how the hospital was run and tried to expand in the future brought Paul to the conclusion that he didn't think that unionization would be in the best interest of patients at Beth Israel. But he has no money to combat this campaign, and the SEIU has over 200 staff in Massachusetts alone. They've got a $20 million annual organizing budget, and Paul has a blog that he had started in 2006 called Running a Hospital. So how did the blog end up winning? Well, we're going to take a look at this. First, we're going to examine how unions actually become recognized. So traditionally, there is a vote that takes place. Staff and management are allowed to have a robust discussion. They're allowed to debate. And there's a closed ballot election by workers to determine if union representation is desired or not. There are 2 things that any organization can agree to that paves the way for unionization. The first is what's known as a neutrality agreement. In a neutrality agreement, management agrees to not say anything about the unionization process, and effectively the union becomes the only source of information about whether workers should or should not join a union. You can imagine what effect that has on the information and the sentiment that workers have. The second is what's known as a card check process. And in a card check process, once the hospital or organization agrees, there's actually no election or debate. Once enough workers sign a unionization authorization card, the union is automatically recognized as the bargainer on behalf of workers. Instead of triggering an election, it just triggers unionization. And this is rife with opportunities for intimidation and influence. There's no secret ballot involved. But importantly, the organization has to agree to both of those things, which of course, Paul and Beth Israel do not want to do. So what are the lessons that, or before we think about lessons, let's look at the party map. So we can see BIDMC management here. We have nurses, residents, we have the doctors, donors, the board. We have other Boston hospitals. We have regulatory and financing agencies. We have religious and ethnic groups. Beth Israel was very involved in the Jewish community and had a very proud legacy there. We have politicians who are very keenly interested in how unionization efforts play out. And we have the media, which is going to typically be responsible for conveying a lot of the information about this negotiation to all of these folks. So the SEIU comes, and the SEIU is going to target all of these different groups to try and set the narrative for why why the workers at Beth Israel should unionize, and why Beth Israel should agree to either a neutrality agreement or the card check process. So how did Paul approach this armed with just a blog in order to prevent this from happening? The first lesson that we can draw from Paul's experience is know your interests. sounds really self-explanatory. But importantly, we'll see that Paul's blog allowed for those goals to be clearly stated. No one else was able to manipulate or delay what the goals actually were and how quickly folks understood what those goals were. So Paul believed that unionization would negatively impact quality of care at BIDMC. And he didn't want to agree to a neutrality agreement or a card check process. And importantly, what we recognize here is that Paul's interests couldn't be improved by negotiating. So in effect, this was an effort to not negotiate with the SEIU. And critically, it's not possible to really split the difference with what he's talking about. This isn't a, we have a pie and we're arguing about how to divide it up. This is a, do workers get information from management? There's not really an in-between there. Do workers have a secret ballot to decide whether there's a unionization effort or not? Again, not a whole lot of middle ground. We either have a secret ballot or we don't. Lesson 2 is to understand your stakeholders and their various pressure points. So here, the blog allowed for everyone to be on the same page and for Paul to respond quickly. This was a multi-year campaign. And so when you think about Paul's perspective, he has bosses, he has the board. And all of these board members have their own networks, businesses, and interests that the SEIU could try and target or influence in order to have them in turn put pressure on Paul. On the employee side, we have the actual targets of the unionization effort, the staff, and we have the doctors who might not be targets for a union, but absolutely consider themselves an important part of the hospital. They are, but also sometimes an important measure to also advocate for what staff want and need. If they felt pressure to support unionization efforts, that would be a big blow. And we also have community and partners. So we have affiliate hospitals, which were a crucial component of Beth Israel's network, politicians, of course, and also the Jewish community, which really can't be understated here. The Jewish community has long-standing support for unions and progressive causes, particularly in the United States. And given the recent turnaround in difficult times that the hospital had just faced, it had leaned on that community incredibly hard in order to make it through that transition. And Paul himself is also Jewish and connected to the Jewish community. This is something where the blog allowed for Paul to communicate externally, but he also says that if he was going through a situation like this today, this is something where current social media capabilities and trends would be even more important, allowing you to really get a deep audit of what your organization looks like, where potential sources of influence and pressure points are, and respond accordingly. And that brings us to lesson 3, which is be proactive. Paul's blog was able to develop an audience of trust. His readership at the blog was actually over 10,000 people strong. And it wasn't just folks at Beth Israel, but it was state legislators, members of the media, folks in other hospitals around the country, and even federal legislators in Washington, D.C. And Paul used the blog to describe the SEIU campaign. So he said, the SEIU is going to come with billboards and protests. They're going to say that we mistreated patients, which, given the laws about what you can and can't say about how you treat patients, are very difficult to refute. And here he was able to anticipate and preempt their moves extraordinarily quickly. The blog communicated what a campaign would look like, and this inoculated the press against a lot of SEIU attacks. Often when the SEIU made another claim or tried something, members of the media would often reach out to Paul directly and say, is this part of that campaign that you told us about? When the SEIU tried to mail leading surveys, characterized them as towards doctors in the hospital, Paul was able to respond in less than an hour through his blog. And importantly, you should also just use the tools available. Paul had this blog prior to the SEIU announcing that they wanted to come and try to unionize Beth Israel. And so he had a genuine connection and built up trust with everyone that was part of his readership. Importantly, the SEIU website didn't have that. It didn't exist before the SEIU came to town, and it didn't have the same level of genuine. still alive and well today, but doesn't look like it's been updated in years. Finally, you've figured out what you want to happen. You have your goal. You have trust that you've developed between all of your various stakeholders. Now you need to clearly state your values and principles. And this is kind of the secret sauce that actually work. Paul didn't anchor his opposition or his positions on whether Beth Israel should unionize or not. He anchored it on the rights of those staff in the unionization process. So he anchored his values on democracy, on recognizing the right to unionize, but focusing on the card check and neutrality agreements, making sure that workers, whether they supported or opposed unionization efforts, they'd have a secret ballot, they wouldn't be retaliated against, and folks would have the freedom to vote their conscience and not be muzzled. That was absolutely key. And anytime he could instantly re-anchor the conversation on those values and keep bringing folks back to a position that ultimately prevailed. The conclusion, of course, is that the blog was victorious. The SEIU didn't attempt to collect cards from staff to authorize the union. Board members never suggested that Paul give in to the SEIU's demands. In fact, board members gave Paul one of those shirts that the union was handing out outside that said "Fire Paul Levy" as a joke at a board meeting. And this was seen as a very poor outcome internally by the SEIU. They had leaders in Massachusetts be reassigned and demoted or leave the organization over this effort, which was widely seen as very unsatisfactory. And importantly, federal legislation to implement the card check process without the consent of management in organizations failed to advance. And some legislators on Capitol Hill actually cited Paul's blog and his experience with the SEIU in this effort as a reason why that legislation didn't even advance to a committee vote, much less a vote on the floor. So that is, in summary, how Paul Levy and his personal blog managed to go up against the SEIU and win a multi-year corporate negotiation campaign. So with that, I think we're going to jump back to the present day, or closer to the present day, and learn about one more case.
So, Isaac, thank you very much. This is a case of an extremely early form of social media, a blog that Paul had built up credibility and audience, which I think is an important lesson, by treating very sensitive subjects such as his salary, such as medical mistakes of the hospital and other things early on, had built up this large audience. And that provided what Alvaro was talking about as a very quick, very inexpensive way to communicate. And the comments that he frequently got helped him to learn a lot, and then could be influential on behalf of what otherwise looked like indomitable other side. So Isaac, if you can unshare your screen, and we're going to look at a third example in this range of exploratory cases about the roles of social media in negotiation. So Ben, back to you. Isaac, you're still sharing your screen. Oh, sorry, I take that back. You're all set. Ben? Ben, you're muted.
Hi, everyone. Okay, thank you, Jim. And thank you, Isaac, for that. We're now going to turn to a much more in-close, much more hyper-local example, the cannabis example, so this should be fun. Again, I just want to start by going back to our metaphor here of the British and the Revolutionary War. Even tech-savvy companies like Amazon can be completely outclassed, but a hospital executive armed with nothing but a blog can defeat one of the most powerful unions in the country. The thing to remember here is that this is a new discipline. This is a new battlefield. It's a revolution. So we're now going to turn to an early exploration of some practical applications, specifically, as we mentioned before, with enhanced party mapping and better informed coalition management. And our overall objective here is to either gain or mitigate against information asymmetries. So I'm going to use a case study to demonstrate this. This is the case of the man you see here, Mike Dundas, and his company, a legal cannabis company known as Sage Naturals, and their experience negotiating with the town of New Millbury, Massachusetts. Now, we've blinded the name of the town, and throughout you'll see these little white markers blinding key information and key details. Every aspect about this case is public. All of the information that we'll present here has been shared publicly before, but as Jim mentioned at the offset, there's some really important privacy concerns that we want to be careful about. And so out of an overabundance of caution, we've just taken that proactive step of blinding all of the key details and using fake names like New Millbury.
I would also just very quickly notice that two of the players in the case, Mike Dundas and Pat Fox, are in our audience today, so they may also want to comment on what's going on.
And those are their real names. We obtained their permission and invited them to this session. So just to give a quick background of the case before we dive in and spend the majority of our time talking about the specific findings that we've uncovered through the use of social media intelligence. Mike Dundas, an entrepreneur, built, when medical marijuana was legalized in Massachusetts, built a $10 million production facility in the town of New Millbury, where he was a quiet corporate citizen, a good taxpayer, no issues. But when recreational marijuana was legalized in Massachusetts, a provision of that legislation allowed for local municipalities to ban pot establishments by referendum. And when that happened, a local mom, a hockey mom, began a grassroots campaign to try and establish New Millbury as a town where there would be no legal cannabis allowed. So this was this initially only targeted retail establishments, but was later expanded through a somewhat shady process to include Mike Dundas's facility as well. And so this posed an existential threat to his business. So he hired an external, very well-regarded, rather famous firm to mount an aggressive campaign to try to persuade the town not to pass this referendum. You can see here a mailer that they sent out accusing the town of doing something fishy with the referendum. And this was incredibly poorly received. This is a small, very tight-knit town, and this mailer was perceived as overly slick, too aggressive, completely out of touch. And so when the ballot measure came around, Mike Dundas lost. And so this was, bankruptcy was right around the corner for his company. And however, due to a quirk in Massachusetts state law and the way these small New England towns are run, the results of this referendum, in order to come into effect, had to be affirmed in what's called a town meeting, essentially a legislative body of the town. So this provided a narrow window of 30 days during which Mike Dundas could negotiate with the activist and key community leaders to try to head off this bankruptcy. So he brought in this man you see here, Pat Fox, a brilliant strategist who helped him organize an on-the-ground, word-of-mouth, human-to-human campaign using trusted community leaders that was ultimately successful. So this is good news. But without the benefit of social media intelligence, Mike Dundas, navigating this campaign, was forced to rely on the instinct of smart people like Pat Fox, the so-called expertise of these famous firms that he brought in that led this massively miscalibrated campaign, and then ultimately a significant amount of luck when he was able to find and connect with, through a series of personal introductions, these community leaders who he was able to recruit to his cause. So what we're hoping to do is replace instinct, expertise, and luck with social media intelligence. And specifically, again, as Jim mentioned, we're looking at ways you can learn about the situations on the ground, influence the key parties, and then mobilize coalitions in an effective way. Again, in this very local human-to-human campaign on a very tight timetable. So to paint the picture of how these techniques might be applied, we're gonna hear a brief clip from our interview with Mike Dundas, just to give a little bit more color.
The primary technique that we used was sort of word of mouth, personal connections, friends of friends, people that had personal connections that could use the telephone to make this outreach. In hindsight, it would be extraordinarily valuable to have a playbook that could be quickly, in a day or two, internalized for how to utilize social media to go and find, basically go and map the space. And then also to root out and find who a finite list of people who are sitting on town meeting. I mean, that would be very easy to basically troll Facebook and listen to what they're saying. And I mean, you know this better than I do, this is what you're doing, but like, as I hear you talking, sort of light bulbs are just going off all around. I mean, people are just giving you this stuff for free. I mean, it's right there. People typically just lay it all out. And so, yeah, I think it would have been extraordinarily valuable. And then it seems like we could have been even more effective.
So hopefully that gives you all a flavor for, we always like it when someone says, light bulbs are going off in their heads. But the key thing that Mike Dundas describes there, this idea that people are giving you this stuff freely on Facebook, and it would be very easy to go trawl through and find relevant bits of information. To a large degree, that's true. But you'll find very quickly, if you try doing this yourself, even in a small town like New Millbury, there are just haystacks and haystacks of data. And it is very difficult to go through and sort out which aspects of that are relevant and useful and not just going to be a distraction in the negotiation. So what we've done is we've borrowed from fields like investigative journalism, human rights research that have begun to pioneer techniques in open source data intelligence, research, analysis, to find these things in a much more systematized and quicker basis. So what we're gonna do is just give a quick snapshot of 3 aspects of how these techniques might be applied. We're gonna look at the counterparty, the chief counterparty, this hockey mom I mentioned. We're gonna look at ways that you might interrupt the formation of hostile coalitions. And then we're finally gonna turn to ways that you might foster more friendly coalitions to come to your support. So to begin with, this is our main counterparty. Like I said, a hockey mom, a suburban mom. We'll call her Dana Navarro. And she is a typical small town suburban mom. So what Mike Dundas has told us about her is that she is steeped in the stigma around marijuana. You see her here that, we don't want to make New Millbury the pot destination. She hates this idea that the image of the town that she grew up in will be tarnished by potheads, pot dealers, this whole pot culture. She's a conservative. She doesn't like the hippie element of marijuana. But if you look at the accounts that she follows on her personal Instagram, Facebook pages, her main source of health and wellness and fitness information is this account, who actively, regularly posts content supporting the use of THC in specific medical conditions, or CBD to treat broader health issues like back pain. So and then if you look at her personal Instagram account, the yoga studio that she likes posts content like this. So while she may be consciously steeped in the stigma around marijuana use, she exists in this broader culture that you could describe as either pro-cannabis or cannabis adjacent. So if you're looking for a way to engage with her more effectively, you might borrow language, imagery, framing, arguments from these trusted sources that are going to be, she's going to be much more receptive to hearing those kinds of framings than the maybe more pro-business argument that you might make elsewhere. And a specific tactical application that stands out again and again in Ms. Navarro's posts, you see her concerned with the image of the town. And this plays out in the rest of her life. She volunteers every year at the town's annual cleanup day. They call it Beautification Day. It's a town event that brings the local media, Girl Scout troops, and local businesses to help sort of clean up trash in the greater area. So if Dana is concerned about the impact that pot shops might have on the town's image, why couldn't Mike Dundas have shown up with a couple trucks and some of his guys to help her clean up the town and maybe have an informal human-to-human conversation at that event? So that's one example. Let's turn now to this idea that you might be able to interrupt the formation of these hostile blocking coalitions, and look at the woman you see speaking here, who is a local substance abuse and mental health counselor. She partners closely with the police department, the school board, on these substance abuse panels, discussions, issues like this. Now, she is actively anti-marijuana. You see a post on LinkedIn here that she made about the new marijuana and THC levels in new pot. But the overwhelming focus of these networking breakfasts that you see pictured here is opiate addiction, opioid recovery, and there is a massive volume of information about the potential benefits of marijuana and cannabis use for recovering opiate addicts. So this is probably not enough to convince this person, we'll call her Anna Leonardi, probably not enough to convince her to support cannabis in her town, but maybe enough to peel away or create divisions within this coalition so that it doesn't emerge as a key blocking vote with the police department, the school board, and other influential local areas. So we'll end with a view of friendly coalition formation and a quick look through local media channels, local Facebook groups. This man here you see on the left, we'll call him John Carmine, is a local real estate agent, an aspiring conservative politician in the area who supports several state-level legislatures, again, conservatives, who have come out in favor of cannabis legalization, either to help treat PTSD among veterans or for the sheer tax benefits. And this man has in fact listed and sold properties in the commercial business district in New Millbury, where Mike Dundas's facility is located. So as a potential target to reach out to this man, he might be very receptive to the idea that this could cast a pallor over the commercial viability of this business district. And he could be a key outpost in the conservative community that has come out against Mike Dundas's presence in the town. So there's far too much to go into in this format, but just to close, we're gonna play a quick clip from Pat Fox describing how, again, you talk about learn, influence, and in this case, mobilize, ways that you might be able to use social media to mobilize more effectively on a small scale.
Social media has been crucial in every project we've been doing and is going to become more so. The great thing that I like doing with social media that's highly effective now is to find the problem. On a development project, I start off thinking announcement backwards if I have enough time. Who is standing with me when I announce? What support can I show when I announce? Because that's going to back off a bunch of opposition if you're lucky. You can set the right tone. So let's say you tell me that you want to put in a cannabis cultivation facility in a community. So what if we had a local taxpayer group that said, we need more commercial development, but we don't want commercial development that's going to generate traffic. We don't want more retail sprawl. Our taxes are going up and we need commercial development to help keep it down, but we need smart commercial development. And gee, what would that be? That would be things like, and we give a list of 5 things, and on that list might be a marijuana cultivation facility. Now, I could start a Facebook group of people that think that way, talk about other issues in town, talk about other projects. This one does work under that scenario. This one doesn't. Gee, why can't we get more developers in here that do that when suddenly this guy, Mike Dundas, comes walking in and that's it. That's exactly what we've been looking for. Might even be able to get someone to write and I love doing this, to get a bunch of people to sign a letter
to solicit,
saying, we'd love you to come and look here.
Right.
To have Mike come into town and say, I came because you asked. And social media can help you set that up.
So hopefully that gives a good sense of some of the potential applications of social media in negotiation. Again, when it comes to learning, when it comes to influencing different coalitions, and finally, as Pat Fox was just describing, when it comes to mobilizing people on the ground. So with that, back over to Jim.
So I hope the richness of these presentations justified the somewhat longer time that we used. I would only note that this is an area both in scholarship and in practice that is very quickly evolving. And what we've tried to do is look at a quick range to see what is in fact going on and what might be possible. So from public to private, from small to large, and various combinations. But you notice that we looked everything from a recent critical decision of the German Constitutional Court that could influence negotiations at the European Central Bank, the TTIP negotiations, Amazon's HQ2 negotiations that failed from Amazon's point of view, succeeded from the opponents, Beth Israel SEIU, and the town of New Millbury, and the marijuana cultivation, the cannabis cultivation activities of Mike Dundas. I had initially thought to turn to the protagonists for special comment, but there are a lot of interesting questions that have come up on the chat, and because of our time limits, let me first turn to David Lax for sort of comment on what we've seen here.
Okay. Well, you know, I think part of what's interesting here is we're trying to use this as a tool to prepare for and carry out negotiation. And as you look at the three negotiations that Isaac and Ben talked about, one of the things you have to do to be effective, and I think this is also going to be true in the ECB case, is really focus on the actual target deal you want and the mechanism by which that gets decided. So in the New York State HQ2 case, Gianaris was going to be appointed to a public authorities control board on which there was consensus decision making, and so he could block things. And that was why his appointment was such a critical step. And to understand that and prepare for that would have been very important. Similarly, at Beth Israel, it was the neutrality and card check votes, or rule decisions, which seem more neutral than they actually are. And then in New Millbury, it was the town meeting and understanding how the rules of that, in each case, understanding the mechanism and then working backwards to say, how do we do our 3D party mapping and use these tools to both really understand and influence. And I think in both of Ben's cases, there's a lot more that could be talked about how to analyze analyze the interests of parties and identify parties like he did in New Millbury, who could have been or were useful, but could have been used as part of a broader negotiation strategy. So,
Joel, you had a question in the chat area that actually intersected with something that Catherine raised. I wonder if you could frame that question for people to think about.
Sure. We've had a little chat on the side. And the basic question is that rates of change of technology often are exponential, and rates of change in institutional actors and institutions are at best linear. Sometimes they're even slower than that. And so the core question that's posed by all of these cases, and David Lax's comments reinforces it, is that institutions, which are the holders of the rules of the game, aren't sufficiently agile to adapt and respond to the dynamics, in this case, of social media as a technology. And so the question is, how can we rethink about institutional arrangements that might co-evolve with the technology? And the chat has gone on to talk a little bit about these different kinds of coalitions and multi-stakeholder consortia, some of which can be manipulated, as we heard in these cases, but some of which represent the potential elements of new institutional arrangements in society. So it's really a question of institutions that can co-evolve with technology.
Catherine?
Yeah, so I think I've written a whole piece about this with Jim, which Jim made reference to, which is called exactly bypass bureaucracies, because that's exactly true. So the way that our hierarchically designed systems operate, they're just not responsive enough. And so in all of the cases, we've seen that where it's been successful, including with a blog, which seems something that almost reminiscent of the 90s, but it was close to the source. It created trust, it created vulnerability, it created connection, all these key ingredients that are necessary to begin to pull in stakeholders or anticipate where stakeholders might object. And so I think where we've seen this oftentimes, and that's why the Amazon case is the counterpart, and it is so interesting because that's a place where sort of a city failed to anticipate and to get ahead of the game. But a lot of times it's in smaller entities where democracy is more porous, and where over the past, roughly decade also, this idea of smart democracy, smart power, smart governance has taken over. That's partially technology driven, but that's also brought people closer to one another. So I think they're about things like participatory budgeting and how negotiation works around participatory budgeting. So if you can get close, if you can use technology to get closer to the trust building entities, and that's where it often does work on an urban level, because the direct democracy component is built into the urban level. That's, I think, an interesting area for further research. And conversely, and I like that Joel points out that we need new institutions, because clearly rebuilding and rejigging the institutions as they function now will be difficult, but it doesn't absolve us from doing the work within the institutions. And we're seeing some of that break open, but again, way too slowly to meet, I think, the challenges of where we are now, which is the data revolution that goes far beyond what we've initially been discussing, is the communication and reframing revolution that we've gone through over the past now 7-8 years.
This idea of building an audience that trusts you and in which you have credibility is an enormous asset. Pat Fox, in the clip that we saw, indicated how if he had a little bit of time, he almost could have preempted this whole thing by building up a welcoming coalition rather than one that was intended to be oppositional. Paul, in terms of his blog, had slowly built up a wide readership that had everything from health reporters and members of the various stakeholders in the hospital who were able to be communicated with essentially costlessly and instantly. And in a very early use of social media, I think triumphed over something that was much larger. I think we can see this as a theme going through. Paul, do you want to comment on not just on your case, but you've now seen, as everybody has, kind of this wider range of cases. What strikes you?
Thanks, Jim. I think this question of institutions and how they respond, as always, goes to the leadership of the institution. For years, we've expected CEOs and other top corporate leaders to represent their companies and their companies' interests with the mainstream media and with trade journals and so on. I think it's incumbent on those people now to understand that part of their job is to be engaged in the social media as well. We certainly see that in the highest office in the land, for better or worse. Bezos could have taken on AOC during that debate directly. He chose not to. Imagine how it might have played out if he had. Would it have neutralized it? Would it have spread it? Who knows? But if you're not prepared to do that, you're going to let somebody else decide the issue for you.
Some of these situations really are or come across as a zero-sum battle. But if you look more closely, you can imagine outcomes in the Amazon case that would have offered a lot of benefit for a lot of people and a lot of stakeholders. If you look more closely at the New Millbury case, actually the activist who was so oppositional ultimately got a victory in a commitment for no retail in New Millbury and yet economic development. And so in a sense, both sides were able to win. Some of these situations are very, very different, but Sheila Heen in the comments, I think,
talked about how easy these things could be essentially to be purely oppositional. And Sheila, if you wanted to expand a little bit on that point.
Well, I've been struck by listening how the fact that the conversation is public backs people into corners because people are quickly characterized as big bad, fill in the blank, or naive, only a housewife mom, to feel dismissive because we feel attacked. And there's been so much work done in the negotiation field about how to shift traditional negotiation structures and stakeholder maps to become more problem solving. And it just makes me think about the public nature identity hook, good guy, bad guy, zero sum. And do we have new lessons to learn? Paul's blog, I think, is partly that. New lessons to learn for how to change a public narrative.
That strikes me as also very congruent with what we saw yesterday on the characteristics of productive conversations and ones that tend to work in the opposite direction. And you can imagine a marriage of some of that technology with some of what we're talking about here. Ron, you had an institutional observation as well. And you're muted. Let me unmute you.
Thank you, Jim. I think this ties to some of the themes coming up, because a common theme, it seems, in these various examples is that incumbents are in this catch-up game and formal strength becomes vulnerability. So, Catherine, you're really talking about MFAs being behind the curve. Then you're talking about a David versus Goliath story in Amazon. Interestingly, Isaac in SEIU, it's the union who has the greater strength. And it's, Paul and Beth Israel who are really vulnerable and at risk. So I guess the question is, how important in this new world is the lack of formal power? And is weakness or perceived weakness actually an advantage in the world of social media? And I guess conversely, does growing influence actually make you more vulnerable?
So with regret, we're at our final time here. Catherine reminds me of something that we didn't do for this panel, which is post a series of background papers, and we will do that. There are two of hers in particular that I think are quite insightful and broad-ranging, and there are a number of others. But as you could see from my queries to some of the most distinguished negotiation scholars around, the reaction was, in this field, unlike many nearby and allied fields, there just isn't that much good work that's been done. And particularly if the methodology forces you into lab studies, and that's pretty much the talking and the direct interpersonal interaction, what David and I would call the 1D or the tactical and interpersonal side of negotiation. And yet the outcome is so heavily influenced and often determined by actions away from the table. If you imagine a world without social media, that's a very different kind of negotiation than a world with social media. And both understanding, diagnosing, and prescribing feels kind of like a wide open set of opportunities. Now, there's some people who've done this, who've made a number of steps in it. Joel has a number of interesting papers that he uses, has written sites. Michael Matthew's on the call as well. But I hope that this session, and frankly, a remarkable set of presenters from Alvaro and Catherine and Ben and Isaac, I hope that they've done what in a new and developing field is really the best service of all, which is to say, what are the most interesting questions that we should systematically investigate and draw generalizations beyond the particular. So I want to thank our audience with a round of virtual applause, and we'll go from there. Thank you all.
Great. Thank you.
And I'm happy to stick around for a little bit, and people who want to continue the conversation are more than welcome to. So there are a couple of our protagonists, both Pat and I see Mike Dundas is behind a big M. You'd be welcome to comment if you like, Pat, as well. Because of course, there was a case in which you were involved in, quote, New Millbury, unquote, but you've now seen quite a range from the areas that you're most heavily involved with to some ones that are pretty distant. I'm just curious, what sorts of thoughts have struck either you, Pat, or Mike in listening to this?
Hey, Jim, before they answer, this is Joel. If I could also just make a quick note to everyone that's still on the call. There's a lot of material here for the Negotiations Journal special issue, not just from the presenters, but there are people on the call who may have thoughts that they want to, build in on this. And I just want to make it an open invitation for folks to lean in on this topic.
Thanks, Joel. Pat?
I was struck by one of your early slides that talked about moving forward ethically. And I think one of the things that everyone has to be aware of is that there are players that are not acting ethically. You can, when negotiations are underway on a development project, on something in a corporate arena that we might be working on, one of the strategies is to out the negotiation, make public what no one wants public. If you're trying to make sure that negotiation doesn't proceed, it's a development project that somebody else doesn't want to happen, and I think you have to be prepared for players that are not acting ethically in trying to advance the ball, but are trying to take the ball and run away. The mapping that you talked about, we are doing it in a far less sophisticated way on virtually every project, where we are looking at elected officials, major players in town, and mapping manually who do they talk to, what do they say, and trying to come up with dossiers. When we're talking to them, what are the points they're going to care about? What are the positions they've already staked out? But digital tools that would help us do that, would be fantastic and extremely useful in those situations.
I should have introduced Pat a little more broadly. He's founder and chair of something called Consensus Strategies, which is carried out a very large, or advised on a very large number of campaigns, both for and against various legislation, developments, and otherwise. And one of the things, Pat, that I hope that we did in, for example, demonstrating some of the tools when Ben Cook was showing how you could look at a snapshot of Twitter traffic and then analyze it for its network and graph characteristics, and in so doing, learn about parties that you might not have even been aware of, which could be key allies or blockers or otherwise. There's a lot of technology which maps very closely to what Catherine was saying ministries of foreign affairs aren't doing too much of right now, but certainly could. And those things flow into negotiations. The ethical issue, I think, is pretty acute in this area, because obviously in the public sphere, the uses of disinformation in political campaigns, in smearing opponents, in doing all kinds of things, as well as just out and out invasion of privacy by hacking and disclosing and so forth. One has to be pretty careful about what's public, what's legitimate. We hope that we drew that line even by blinding a case that's fully public and was debated in public, but we just said, let's not use these people as sort of as guinea pigs, if you will, in a conversation like this. And I think it's both offensively to be aware of this, and defensively that you're quite likely to face this, even if you're trying to act in an upstanding kind of way with integrity and so forth. You're very well likely to face another side which may not have the same scruples. Other comments, just kind of looking over the range of these things. Mike Dundas, do you want to join in a little bit?
Well, I would simply observe, and I apologize at the outset here for not having a camera. My wife has our Zoom device of choice with the kids at the moment, so I don't have a camera handy. But I would just say this has been extraordinarily educational for me. I think one of the things that that Paul Levy said really speaks to the way I'm looking at this, which is that it really is incumbent upon organizational leadership to understand these new tools at our disposal. And I just from my experience, we were a much smaller organization than some of the other ones that you've outlined, and we were trying to build this company and running at 1,000 miles an hour. And I don't think that that I paid sufficient attention to the sort of panoply of new tools that were available to us. All of it was just sitting right there, waiting to be looked at and exploited, and I didn't give sufficient attention to it. And so I think, from an executive perspective, this type of discussion, this type of research is going to be absolutely critical going forward.
I would say that the kind of advice David leads, our firm, and there are others who are interested in these things, but advising on complex negotiations that are in some element, in some aspect in the public eye, trying to do this without a deep understanding of the sort of social media ecology, I think is a loser's game these days, and increasingly so. And I think that's one thing that preparing for this session has crystallized in our mind. There are a series of uses, a series of technologies that for traditional negotiation analysis are increasingly going to be central. Michael Maffei, you wrote some interesting papers on organizing, particularly among ride-sharing services and otherwise, and on kind of on the labor side. Having watched this panel, I'd be curious about some of your impressions. Sorry for the cold call, but I'm not really sorry about the cold call.
I thought this was an extraordinary panel. I learned a lot from it, and to see how there are different case uses of social media was very enlightening. One of the things that I think my work looks at is about, there are different information ecosystems based on different types of social media. There's different vectors that information can take through a system. And while most of the cases were about public-facing mediums and using the ability to form conversations or to distribute information in blogs, what I look at in rideshare drivers is how they've used the closed-off elements of social media, or they use closed Facebook groups, or perhaps even direct messages on Twitter to be able to form different types of alliances to find overlapping interests. And so while a lot of the cases public facing may be antagonistic, I wonder if there's a second part of social media which is closed off from view that allows for more interest-based exploration, because you can speak directly to stakeholders and to explore different configurations that you might not have otherwise been able to do in traditional discussions.
I would note that Michael has a couple of really interesting papers. I know at least one of them is public and we can post it, but the other, when you give us the go-ahead, they're really interesting analytical studies of some of the ride-hailing services and how they organized and how those negotiations played out. I would underscore, when we say social media, people think of the big platforms. They think of Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, LinkedIn. These are, really well known. But one of the things that's become very clear in the course of our spending time together is there are a lot of other social media platforms that just abound with information. So, for example, Strava, which groups of people and runners. And it turns out that by mining some of that open information, you could discover where the hidden locations of military bases are by looking at all the routes that the soldiers are jogging around these bases. That's a well-known case. There's Goodreads, which has lots and lots of followers. There are many alumni groups that are out there, and special platforms that facilitate their organization. So these are, it's a much wider universe than one might think from looking at the big platforms. And Michael, when you talked about the, closed Facebook groups, but they're ones that are less obvious.
Yeah, Jim, if I might combine what you just said with what Mike said, this is Joel. One feature of Mike's work is that the Uber drivers were able to reverse engineer some of the algorithms in the Uber platform by talking to each other and figuring out what it was doing to them. And in your comment, it really gets to the underlying logic of the platforms and the technologies. And I think, an interesting thing to explore is, are platforms more or less open and more or less amenable to shared governance and other mechanisms, or in fact, do they require sort of collective action to understand what the platform is even doing?
Yeah, very interesting. Other comments?
Yeah, Mike, I really liked what you just said about the sort of interplay between these tight-knit closed groups and the broader universe of social media. That's something that is increasingly prominent, particularly in the sort of political organizing space. There's a huge trend of, rather than taking a sort of a top-down approach, using these small clusters of often content creators as almost laboratories to create the content that then will spread more effectively through a broader network, and also using them and their accounts to seed that conversation or direct the broader network. So tying that back somewhat to the conversation we had about, how can institutions keep up with these sort of more informal peer-to-peer networks, I think there are a number of these techniques that you've seen adopted in the political world. They're beginning to be adopted in the healthcare world. And I think there are key lessons that you can learn there. But I think that's a really important note, is that this spreads very seamlessly between the small, closed, private communities into cross-platform interactions in a really interesting way.
Interesting. Mitch, you research mis and disinformation and so forth. And if you wanted to chime in, I'd love to hear some of your reactions. You've seen kind of a cross section of a bunch of different cases, which we're looking in an exploratory way. I'm curious if you wanted to chime in here.
Sure. Can everyone hear me?
Yep.
Yes.
Great. Hi, everybody. My name is Mitch. I am a mis and disinformation researcher at UT Austin, looking at what seems to be what everyone wasn't able to look at, which was what I classify as memetic content. So screenshots, memes, other peer-to-peer content, sketchy YouTube links being spread on social media, and sort of the underbelly of what bypasses the filters. And I've been working with Ben, who graciously invited me today, on a paper regarding how fringe groups organize on these encrypted messaging apps and then spread their content towards sort of the broader web and the mainstream platforms. And so a lot of my work is under the notion that you can track fake news, but you can't track screenshots of fake news. So there's some very interesting developments, especially around coronavirus, which have sort of innovated on the mechanics traditionally, as they do every month to month or country to country. But what I'm very curious to hear, I've definitely seen the mechanics, but I've certainly not been on the negotiation side. And one of the most common formats of what I look at is somebody on social media who's taken a screenshot of an article and then added their commentary above it, or highlighted something within the screenshot. And that gets the content across without actually allowing folks to link back through and verify and read the article themselves. So the more fringe you get, the more radicalized the severance of that information gets spread. And so I'm curious if anyone has some examples that they can think of that I might have been talked to, where there were conversations within peer groups that have affected the sort of factions that Ben discussed, which are sort of on a macro scale. I could definitely talk to that, but I don't have anything relevant at the moment.
Well, I think that, Mitch, this is really interesting, and I think this is one of those topics which when Mike Dundas was kind of saying light bulbs were going off in my head, there are a series of I wanted to say discrete areas where we could probe much more deeply, but I have a feeling that these are not discrete areas, but they'll bleed into one another. But focusing on this aspect or that aspect will really make a significant difference. One of the things that David and Ron and Paul Levy, myself, Isaac, and others who advise on complex negotiations, one of the things that sometimes is puzzling to others is that we're not talking about, quote, the negotiation, which isn't that the chit chat at the table, isn't that the direct interpersonal interaction? And of course it's that. But if you ask what conditions that and what influences that, and to draw the analytic circle and exclude those things, I think is really to make a mistake. By the same token, I have many friends who are active in, say, marketing or political campaigns or lobbying efforts or otherwise. And many times they are heavily focused on shaping the overall environment, but the actual negotiation at the table piece of the story is kind of assumed. I don't want to say to take care of itself, but that's kind of somebody else's job once you set the ground. And I hope what we're showing here by these examples is that there's a very tight connection, which is unhappily unexplored to the level that it deserves, between those away from the table actions and what really happens in the face-to-face or Zoom linked or email conversations that are actually making the decisions that determine whether the target deal is realized or not. And even if it's realized, New York did get Amazon to say yes, but the deal wasn't sustainable and it wasn't implemented. So, both make the deal, implement, and have it sustainable are kind of elements of this this piece of the story. So I really appreciate this follow-on discussion. Last comments. I want to leave a little time for those who are going to join at 1:30 for the next couple of possible sessions. But Dave, you want to jump in here?
One thing that I think this effort of preparing for this conference has convinced me of is something that people aren't probably doing in preparing for negotiations, but will become part of our repertoire, which is, and it goes to part of what Mitch was talking about and Ben with disinformation, is before you, and when you plan and think about engaging in a negotiation, you really want to step back all the way to say, how are we vulnerable? So what's the, in a way that I don't think we've ever done before. How do people perceive us? How will they attack us? What are the opportunities? And how do we prepare proactively for that? But I think that's something that we've never talked about before, and yet really has to become part of every negotiation strategy. And it need not be just disinformation, but I think you have to build in the probability that that will happen. And the broader and the more public the negotiation, the more likely it will be that that happens. But you need to actually do an audit. And Ben, you probably have a word to describe what we're talking about here. But I think that's going to become part of the basic repertoire of, if a big company says, okay, we want to negotiate X, which has regulatory or other political ramifications, even tangential ones, we want to be prepared for that.
Yeah,
you have the word.
Yeah,
I do. That's a, and we go into this more in the papers that we're basically summarizing in this discussion. But the term is borrowed from cybersecurity. We call it red teaming. It's essentially putting on your evil hat and then looking at yourself through the lens of an opponent and asking yourself, what would I do if I were in my opponent's shoes? And it's a really useful technique, not only to uncover those vulnerabilities, but to help direct research so that you are able to dig in more deeply and understand who those opponents are, what the lines of attack might be, right, and then take proactive steps to kind of mitigate the concerns. So yes, the term red teaming.
Red teaming. And interestingly, Jim and I did that 25 years ago, maybe 20 years ago. We were helping a company called Guinness merge with a company called Grand Metropolitan to become Diageo, which is the biggest liquor company in the world. And it was being opposed in its efforts to do that by a French company called LVMH, which is the biggest luxury goods company in the world, run by Bernard Arnault, who is sort of France's self-styled corporate raider. And what we did is we hired another law firm. First, we asked our law firms, how would Bernard Arnault sue us? What are all the things he could do? And we got this from our existing law firms. kind of weak responses. And I said, Ben, I could do, you know, I said to them, look, I could do in an hour a much better job than we probably paid you a lot of money to do. And we hired another law firm and said, okay, you're Bernard Arnault, find all the lawsuits, all the ways that you can try to obstruct this. And then we prepared for those, and he did about 20% of them, and we were ready. So we've done that, but this is a much broader context with many more tools, and I think the red teaming is going to be very important going forward.
Catherine?
Yeah, I just wanted to add a two-figure to that, because I would have also added the red team piece. But what it also does, it might force you back to sort of the analog table, which in diplomatic negotiations means that as you're looking into the entire spectrum, what part of this are you then going to have to go back to an interagency process or an other bureaucracy process, so that your red team perspective is a complete one? And because could have mentioned this in my intro remarks, so much of what limits the creativity of any Western democratic MFA is so many slices of this pie are outsourced to other bureaucracies. Cyber is the DoD domain, intelligence is in this. So meaning to say, so on a diplomatic level, this means that everything that David and Ben just rightly mentioned will also force you to rethink sort of the analog traditional table set as well, so that your red team picture ends up being as complete as possible.
In the course of writing a case study on what we here called New Millberry, Patrick Fox turns out to have been his own red team, in the sense, if I remember the quote right, I am uniquely paranoid. I imagine that if I were a hyper version of myself, what would I do to foil what I myself am now doing? And really carry this out. And that's a very good way to assess vulnerabilities. And one of the things I think that David said, you know, in our advisory work, we think of ourselves as having special competence in strategic and complex negotiations. But we typically partner with law firms, with investment banking firms, with consulting firms of different kinds. And it strikes me that there's going to be a consistent form of partnering where strategic negotiation analysis is really linked in and informed by, and in turn informs, people who are really good at the kinds of things, the capabilities we're developing here.